Okay. I think we should dive into something that I think resonates with pretty much everyone.
Okay.
That feeling of financial anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the one where bills start piling up and then
Yeah.
unexpected expenses pop up and you're left with that like
Oh, yeah.
nagging sense of never having enough.
Right.
Almost like a universal experience, wouldn't you say?
I think you're absolutely right. And I think what makes it even trickier is we live in this society that constantly bombards us
Yeah.
with messages about what we should,
Yeah.
the kind of lifestyle we need to be living.
Right.
It's easy to get caught up in that
Totally.
and feel like we're falling short.
Exactly. And that brings us to our deep dive today.
Okay.
We're going to be looking at whether faith,
Mhm.
specifically faith in God, can truly offer a way out of this financial anxiety.
Right.
We've got a really interesting set of sources here.
Yeah.
A mix of Bible verses and like a devotional piece
Okay.
that both focus on this idea of God's promise of provision.
And what's really interesting is how these sources go beyond just talking about like material needs, like
Yeah.
having enough money.
Right.
They delve into this deeper sense of security and trust that has implications for all areas of life.
So let's unpack this concept of God's provision.
Okay.
What does it actually mean in a biblical context?
Yeah.
It feels like a much broader idea than just like,
Right.
God will make sure you have enough money.
It is broader, and it's really at the heart of understanding this whole conversation.
Yeah.
In a biblical sense, provision isn't limited to just having a roof over your head
Right.
or food on the table,
Right.
though those are definitely important.
Right. I see that reflected in some of the verses we have here.
Okay.
Like Philippians 4:19, my God will also supply all your needs according to his riches in glory in Christ Jesus.
Mhm.
That doesn't sound like it's just talking about paying the rent.
Exactly. And look at the imagery used in Psalms 23.1.
Yeah.
The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. It evokes this feeling of being completely cared for and protected,
Yeah.
like a shepherd guiding and providing for their sheep.
That image of the shepherd really struck me too.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder if sometimes when we're stressing about finances,
Yeah.
we forget that we're not alone in this.
Right.
That maybe we're trying to be our own shepherds.
Right.
When there's already one who's got us covered.
It's an important point. If we truly believe that God provides for all our needs,
Mm-hmm.
then our whole perspective has to shift.
Right.
It makes us stop and think,
Yeah.
what are those needs really?
Yeah.
And are we willing to trust that they'll be met?
Yeah.
Even if it's not on our timeline
Yeah.
or in the way we expect.
But if that's the case, if God really is this all-encompassing provider,
Yeah.
then why do we still find ourselves so consumed with financial anxiety? Why are we still worrying?
Yeah.
The devotional seems to pinpoint worry as a major obstacle.
Okay.
In fact, it actually quotes Matthew 6.3134, where Jesus specifically talks about not worrying about food, drink, and clothing.
Right.
Those seem like pretty basic, essential things to be concerned about
Well,
today.
it is fascinating, isn't it? Because even back in Jesus' time,
Yeah.
food, drink, and clothing were the essentials.
Yeah.
His point seems to be that worrying about these things is pointless.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't change the situation, and it actually chips away at our faith in God's ability to provide.
Yeah.
But I think it comes back to what we were talking about earlier.
Right.
Remember, we're not alone,
Yeah.
that there's a shepherd guiding us.
You mentioned earlier that provision includes more than just our physical needs.
Yes,
Could you elaborate on that a bit?
absolutely. Let's think about the deeper implications of God's provision.
Okay.
It also touches on our emotional and spiritual well-being.
Okay.
Perhaps God's provision is also about feeling a sense of belonging,
Okay.
purpose,
Mm-hmm.
and peace,
Yeah.
needs that money can't always address.
So it's less about what's in our bank account and more about a deeper sense of security and trust in a higher power.
Exactly. It's a shift in perspective.
Yeah.
And the devotional uses a powerful analogy to illustrate this.
Okay.
The relationship between a child and their parents.
Right. The devotional talks about how a child completely trusts their parents to provide food, shelter, and care.
Right.
They don't lie awake at night worrying about where their next meal is coming from.
Yeah.
They just inherently trust.
And that's the key point, that inherent, almost instinctive trust.
Right.
The devotional suggests our relationship with God should be similar. That kind of childlike trust. right?
Yeah.
We don't have to be in control of everything.
Right.
But that begs the question.
Yeah.
What might be preventing us from experiencing that same level of trust in a higher power?
Yeah.
What are the beliefs we hold that block us from truly believing in God's abundant provision?
Well, for me, it often comes down to that fear of losing control of not having enough. It's
Hmm.
like my mind automatically jumps to those what if scenarios.
I think that's a common struggle. It's a fear of
Yeah.
lack,
Yeah.
a scarcity mindset.
Right.
We convince ourselves there's not enough to go around,
Yeah.
that we need to control everything to survive.
And so instead of trusting in a higher power,
Yeah.
we end up trying to be our own providers, our
Right.
own shepherds, so to speak.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's
Yeah.
like we're trying to carry a burden that was never meant for us to carry alone.
So if worry is the problem, what does the devotional offer as a solution?
Okay.
I know it points to some practical steps like prayer, shifting our focus, and cultivating gratitude.
Let's dive into those. But first, let's acknowledge that it's easier said than done
Yeah,
to just stop worrying.
right,
Our minds are wired to anticipate problems and look for solutions.
right.
But what if those solutions lie in surrendering the control we think we have?
That's a great point. You're right. It is a bit of a paradox.
Yeah.
But I'm curious to hear how these practical steps play into that.
Well, let's start with prayer, which at its core is about surrendering our anxieties to a higher power.
Mm-hmm.
Philippians 4:6-7 says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus."
So it sounds like prayer isn't just about, like, asking for things.
Right.
It's about actively choosing to lay down our burdens
Mhm.
and trust that they're being taken care of.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
It's about acknowledging that we don't have to carry the weight of the world on our shoulders.
The devotional also mentions shifting our focus as a way to combat worry.
Okay.
It specifically references Matthew 6.33,
Right.
which talks about seeking first God's kingdom and his righteousness.
Yeah.
But what does that actually look like in everyday life, especially
Re-
when it comes to, like, our finances?
That's a really important question.
Yeah.
It's easy to say we're putting God first, but how do we actually translate that into our financial decisions?
Right.
Does it mean changing careers
Yeah.
to pursue something more aligned with our values?
Yeah.
Does it affect how we spend our money
Right.
or how much we give to others?
I've wrestled with those questions myself.
Yeah.
It's like, where's the line
Right.
between meeting our needs and chasing after our desires?
Mm.
How do we know if we're seeking God's kingdom or just trying to build our own little kingdoms here on earth?
Those are the kinds of questions that challenge us to examine our hearts and motivations.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing process of discernment, seeking guidance, and being willing to make adjustments as we go.
And the devotional brings up another key point,
Okay?
the power of gratitude.
Yes.
It emphasizes acknowledging all the ways God has provided for us in the past, even the seemingly small things.
Gratitude is an incredibly powerful tool.
Mm-hmm.
It shifts our focus from what we're lacking to what we already have.
Right.
It helps us recognize the abundance that's already present in our lives.
Mm. And in doing so, it strengthens our faith for the future.
I love the idea of keeping a gratitude journal, which the devotional suggests.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tangible way to record and reflect on all the ways God has been faithful.
It can be a really effective practice.
Yeah.
It helps us to notice those everyday blessings that we might otherwise overlook
Right.
and cultivate a heart of thankfulness.
So we've talked about prayer shifting our focus and gratitude,
Right.
but there's another piece of the puzzle that the devotional really emphasizes.
Okay.
This idea of radical trust.
Yeah.
It closes with a powerful statement.
Right.
Look beyond your paycheck. Look to Him.
That line really resonated with me. It
Mhm.
challenges us to go beyond just believing that God will provide.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing Him as the ultimate source of provision,
Yeah.
not our jobs,
Right.
not our investments, not
Yeah.
anything else.
It's easy to say we believe that in theory,
Right.
but when we're facing real financial pressure,
Mhm. It can be so hard to let go of that feeling of needing to be in control.
absolutely. And I think that's where the fear comes in.
Mm-hmm.
What if we let go of that control and things don't work out the way we planned?
Yeah.
What if we really do end up lacking?
It's a valid fear. I think
Yeah.
a lot of people struggle with that.
Yeah.
But you mentioned earlier that part of God's provision
Right.
might include equipping us with the skills and resources we need
Exactly.
to navigate those challenges.
And this is where faith comes into play.
Mm-hmm.
It's about trusting that even if things don't go according to our plan,
Sure.
God's plan is ultimately for our good.
Yeah.
And that even in the midst of uncertainty,
Mm-hmm.
He's working behind the scenes, orchestrating events,
Yeah.
and providing what we need.
So it's not about sitting back and passively waiting for things to fall into place.
Right.
It's about actively seeking God's will.
Yes.
And trusting that He'll equip us to carry it out.
You got it. And that's where generosity becomes an interesting part of this conversation. 2 Corinthians 9:8 talks about how God can provide more than enough
Okay.
so that we can be generous toward others.
So it's not just about us receiving provision.
Right.
It's about being a conduit of that provision for other people.
Precisely when we recognize that God is the source of our abundance,
Right.
it frees us to be generous with what we have.
Mm-hmm.
It breaks down that scarcity mindset
Yeah.
and helps us see how interconnected we all are.
Like a ripple effect God provides for us, and we're then empowered to provide for others.
Yes.
It reminds me of that quote, "We can't outgive God."
It really is a beautiful reflection of God's character. He's a God of abundance who wants to bless us,
Mm-hmm.
not just for our own sake,
Right.
but so that we can be a blessing to others.
You know, as we've been talking about all of this, I've realized that my definition of provision was way too limited. I was so focused on the material aspects,
Yeah.
on having enough money to cover my expenses,
Right.
that I completely missed the bigger picture.
It's easy to get caught up in the material, especially in today's world.
Yeah.
But these sources remind us that God's provision is much richer and more profound than that.
It really is. This deep dive has been so eye-opening.
Yeah.
It's made me think about how God's provision might extend to other areas of my life, like
Mhm.
my relationships, my career, even my creativity.
It's about trusting that God's provision encompasses our entire being, not just our bank accounts.
That makes me think back to the child-parent analogy. Just
Yeah.
like a good parent provides for their child's emotional and developmental needs,
Right.
God provides for us in ways that go beyond just the physical.
And just like children grow and mature,
Mm-hmm.
our understanding of God's provision can also evolve.
Okay.
We might start by seeking provision for our basic needs.
Yeah.
But as we grow in our faith, we begin to see how His provision encompasses our dreams, our passions, and our purpose.
Right.
It's about learning to trust Him on a deeper level.
I love that idea. It's like a journey of discovering the fullness of what God has for us.
Right.
But, you know, this whole concept of childlike trust brought up another question for me.
Okay.
The devotional seems to imply that God's love is unconditional, just like a parent's love for their child.
Right.
But some might argue that God's love is earned through obedience,
Right.
through following a specific set of rules.
Yeah.
How does that affect our understanding of trust in His provision?
That's a profound question, and it's one that theologians have debated for centuries.
Yeah.
There are different interpretations of God's love and how it relates to our actions.
Okay.
Some believe that God's love is completely unconditional,
Mm-hmm.
while others believe that it's contingent upon our obedience.
So how do we reconcile those different viewpoints with this idea of trusting in God's provision?
I think it ultimately comes down to personal understanding and interpretation.
Okay.
And there's room for a wide range of perspectives within faith.
Mm-hmm.
The key is to grapple with these questions honestly
Yeah.
and to seek understanding through prayer,
Right.
study,
Mm-hmm.
and reflect.
So even in the midst of those theological complexities, we can still choose to trust in God's provision.
Absolutely. Even if we don't have all the answers,
Yeah.
we can still choose to believe that God is good,
Right.
that He loves us,
Yeah.
and that He desires to provide for us.
That's really reassuring because I think sometimes
Yeah.
when we get caught up in trying to understand all the nuances of theology,
Right.
we can lose sight of that simple core belief.
It's easy to get lost in the details, but ultimately faith is about relationship.
Right.
It's about trusting in a loving God who wants the best for us.
So we've talked about how God's provision extends beyond just our finances,
Right.
and we've touched on some of the theological complexities surrounding the nature of His love.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious, how can we apply this understanding of radical trust
Okay.
to our everyday lives,
Yeah.
especially when we're feeling that financial pressure?
That's where it gets really practical, and it's different for everyone.
Yeah.
But I think it starts with a willingness to surrender our need for control.
You've mentioned that a few times now, surrendering control.
Yeah.
But how do we actually do that?
Mhm.
It sounds great in theory,
Right.
but when the bills are piling up,
Yeah.
it's hard to just let go.
I understand it's a process, not a one-time event.
Yeah.
And it often involves baby steps.
Okay.
Maybe it's starting with surrendering a small area of your finances to God.
Okay.
Maybe it's setting aside a portion of your income for giving,
Mm-hmm.
even when it feels like you can't afford it.
Right.
Or maybe it's simply choosing to pray about your financial anxieties
Okay.
instead of letting them consume you.
So it's about finding those little opportunities to practice trust, to let
Exactly.
go of the reins a little bit.
And as you do that,
Yeah.
you start to experience God's faithfulness in tangible ways. You
Mm.
see him provide in unexpected ways.
Right.
You feel his peace amidst the uncertainty.
Yeah.
And you grow in your confidence that he truly does have you covered.
So we've talked about God's comprehensive provision, the tension between trust and worry,
Mm.
and practical steps like prayer and gratitude.
Yes,
But it seems like this idea of radical trust,
right.
of looking beyond our paycheck to the one who provides,
Yeah.
is really the key to unlocking the fullness of what God has for us.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that our security isn't ultimately found in our bank accounts,
Right.
but in our relationship with God.
So let's recap what we've covered so far.
Okay.
We've talked about the biblical concept of God's provision,
Hmm.
which goes far beyond just meeting our basic needs.
Right.
We've explored the tension between trust and worry,
Mm-hmm.
and how fear can often hold us back
Mm-hmm.
from experiencing the fullness of God's provision.
We've also discussed practical steps to cultivate a deeper sense of trust,
Right.
like surrendering our anxieties to God through prayer,
Mm-hmm.
aligning our priorities with his kingdom,
Yeah.
and practicing gratitude for what we already have.
And finally, we've touched on the challenge of radical trust.
Yes.
Recognizing that God is the ultimate source of our provision. Right.
And allowing that truth to transform our mindset and our actions.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It really has.
But here's a final thought-provoking question for you to ponder.
Okay.
If we truly believe that God provides for all our needs,
Mm-hmm.
what might that look like beyond our finances?
That's a great question. It makes me wonder if God's provision extends to things like our emotional well-being,
Absolutely.
our relationships, even our creative endeavors.
It could be trusting that He will equip us with the skills and resources we need
Yeah.
to fulfill our purpose,
Right.
maybe even bring the right people into our lives at the right time.
What if it means being open to the unexpected ways he provides,
Yeah.
the ways that might not fit our preconceived notions of what provision should look like?
Exactly. It's about expanding our understanding of what provision truly means
Right.
and allowing God's abundance to flow into every part of our lives.
I think this deep dive has helped me realize that focusing solely on finances can actually blind us
Right.
to those other forms of provision.
It's like we're so busy looking at the dollars and cents
Yeah.
that we miss the bigger blessings.
It's like trying to fit an ocean into a teacup.
Right.
God's provision is so vast, so multifaceted.
That brings me back to something you said earlier about surrendering control.
Yeah.
If we truly believe in God's provision, doesn't that mean surrendering control not just over our finances, but over our entire lives?
It's a challenging concept, isn't it?
It is.
To truly let go and trust that we are held and guided by something bigger than ourselves.
But maybe that's where the real freedom lies.
Yeah.
Maybe true security isn't about clinging to control,
Right.
but about releasing our grip and allowing ourselves to be carried by a power greater than our own.
It's a beautiful paradox.
Yeah.
The more we surrender, the more we receive, the more we let go, the more we're held.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Okay.
what are some key takeaways you hope our listener will walk away with?
I hope they'll remember that God's provision is all-encompassing. It's not just about our bank accounts. It's about our whole being,
Right.
our emotional, spiritual, and relational well-being.
I hope they'll be encouraged to examine those areas in their lives
Yeah.
where they might be holding on to control too tightly,
Mhm.
those areas where they might need to surrender to a higher power.
And I hope they'll be inspired to cultivate a heart of gratitude,
Right.
to notice and appreciate the many ways God is already providing for them.
Those are all great points. I think for me personally, the biggest takeaway has been the importance of expanding my definition of provision.
Mm.
I've been so focused on the material that I've neglected the emotional and spiritual aspects.
It's a common trap. We live in a very material world.
Yeah.
But these sources remind us that true wealth isn't measured by what we possess,
Right.
but by how deeply we trust in the one who provides.
I love that. So to our listener, if you're feeling that financial pressure,
Yeah,
that anxiety about not having enough,
right.
maybe this is an invitation to take a step back and
Mhm.
consider, where in your life do you need to loosen your grip and allow God's provision to flow?
Maybe it's in your relationships where you've been holding on to hurt or resentment.
Okay.
Maybe it's in your career where you've been striving for success on your own terms.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's in your creative pursuits where you've been afraid to fully express yourself.
Wherever it is, I encourage you to start with a simple prayer. Surrender your anxieties to God.
Mm.
Acknowledge His provision in your life and ask Him to show you where you need to let go.
And be open to the unexpected.
Yeah,
God often works in mysterious ways, and His provision might come in forms you never anticipated.
this has been such a rich and insightful conversation.
It has.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into God's provision. We hope it's encouraged you to look beyond your circumstances and place your trust in the one who holds you in the palm of His hand.
And remember, even when you can't see it, He's working.
Yeah.
He's got you